Hi, this is Sajjad, welcoming you to this video of Nuke Learning. In this video, I am going to explain some about motion blur and the tools we have to create motion blur in Nuke. Motion blur is the apparent streaking of moving objects in a photograph or a sequence of frames, such as film or animation. It results when the image being recorded changes during the recording of single exposure due to rapid movement or long exposure. In major VFX companies, the lighting department renders the CG with motion blur. Rendering with motion blur increases the render time, but as quality and accuracy are the most important factors in production nowadays, they don't rely on the motion blur to comp. Adding motion blur in comp has some advantages and disadvantages. Some of the pros of adding motion blur in comp is clean motion blur with no noise, and the render time will be much cheaper. The cons of adding motion blur in comp is for reflected and refracted surfaces, something like objects in the mirror, also for rounded and radial shapes and rotating objects such as helicopter things or wheels turning. It can't produce accurate results and you will have broken motion blur. Also, post-motion blur only gives you linear motion blur. Now let's go see what tools we have in Nuke to create motion blur. First of all, there are some nodes in Nuke that when you use them, inside their properties, there is motion blur option, such as transform node. As you can see, we have motion blur option here is set to 0. I can increase this, and this node applies motion blur to the movement that is causing. One note to remember is that the shutter offset, by default, is set to start. But if you want to use the motion blur option in such nodes, definitely set it to center. In Python-related videos, I have explained how you can change this option from start to center and set it as default in Nuke, so that you don't need to change it every time you are using, for instance, transform node. To name some other nodes that has this option internally, corner pin node, tracker node, roto and roto paint nodes, scanline render and ray render nodes, camera shake, and so on. You need to be careful when working with these nodes. They don't offer much flexibility, so that motion blur nodes has been created that give you more control and flexibility. The first tool to show is motion blur node. Let's see what Foundry says about this. Motion blur uses the same techniques and technology as the motion blur found in Chronos to add realistic motion blur to a sequence, but presents the controls in a less complex, more user-friendly way. So here I have a roto with a simple shape animated during the time. When I apply motion blur node, by default, it is set to have 3 samples. I can increase to higher numbers like 12 or 15, or any number you see fit for your object. If you see steps, you can increase shutter samples to have better and smoother motion blur. This node is very heavy, and when you are satisfied with the result, definitely pre-comp it.